Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for March 9th, 2023. I'm going to begin with a discussion that comes from some questions I've received from a number of you about what I mean when I talk about the Global South. This has become an increasingly prominent discussion point because we're seeing a collection of nations from the Southern Hemisphere which are moving in a coordinated way of not only rejecting the existing unipolar order, but in creating a new financial and economic development architecture. Now, so beginning with the question of what is the Global South, this is the nations of Asia, Africa, Southwest Asia, the Middle East, South and Central America, which are former colonies of European nations. The British Empire, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Portuguese, the French, and the Germans. For many years, including in some cases for centuries, these nations were looted for the raw materials and cheap labor, including slave labor, and they were deprived of their sovereign rights, all for the benefit of the mother countries or the colonial oppressors. Now, after freedom, and the freedom fights in some cases took decades. But after freedom from colonialism, many faced a sophisticated form of neo-colonialism in the form of control of credit, currency, terms of trade, and these were enforced by institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. The dollar system, which was largely centered in the US and Wall Street, directed prominently by the City of London and its banking community, with junior partners in Brussels, Paris, and Frankfurt. Now, what they did is they maintained the underdevelopment of the so-called developing sector. And to do that, they included the use of Western military and irregular warfare, NATO, projects such as color revolution, regime change, assassination, the launching of terrorist movements, establishment of military bases. For what purpose? To maintain the neo-colonial system, to make it clear that there's only one model of development that's allowed, and that's the one that favors the former colonial powers. When there were revolts against this, as in the case of Iraq or Libya, they were crushed, and more than 1 million were killed in the case of Iraq. In response, there's been a development of new inclusive institutions. For example, rejecting the exclusionary institutions like the Trans-Pacific Partnership of Obama. And instead, you have the BRICS Plus. And now there are more than 20 nations applying to become part of the BRICS. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Forum, the African Union, revival of Mercosur in South America. And these institutions are pursuing regional development perspectives, both in terms of finance and trade, investment and trade. And they're responding to the growing weaponization of the dollar. For example, the seizure of funds from Afghanistan after the US left Afghanistan, or the stealing of assets from Russia, in which case it's over $300 billion worth. All of this is causing countries to look to de-dollarization. Why put your money in Western banks when it could be seized? And why put it in Western banks when it never comes back to your country in the form of development aid? Now, it's not Russian propaganda or Chinese bribes that's leading to de-dollarization and the breakup of the unipolar system. It's the hopes for a better future from these countries and the efforts to escape the control and domination of a hegemonic system of a rules-based order. Now, this is what Putin is talking about when he talks about an epochal, unstoppable transformation. What Xi Jinping is talking about when he speaks of tectonic shifts. And what Helga Zepp-LaRouche discussed with me yesterday as a shift to a new development architecture outside of the control of the dollar system. And I'll have a link at the bottom of the description page for my discussion with Helga from yesterday. Now, we've seen a new self-confidence emerging from the leaders of the Global South. At the last two G20 meetings, for example, we see the Belt and Road Initiative with more than 140 countries participating in some form. And this is a move to an architecture of not one power that uses military and financial means to impose their domination, but of a multilateral system of cooperation for mutual benefit among sovereign nation states, for economic development. Now, as for the West, we see the self-destruction, the rabid green anti-science policy, which is an anti-growth philosophy, plus power concentrated increasingly in the hands of central banks, private financial systems, and so on, that are pushing deindustrialization and austerity, along with military buildup and war. This is what the Ukraine war is about. It has nothing to do with freedom and sovereignty of Ukrainian people. This system is not sustainable, not just because the Global South is rejecting it, but because it's destroying the middle class and the advanced sector, so-called advanced sector, and destroying the capability for future sustainable living. Now, we saw yesterday Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, announce new interest rate hikes, supposedly to fight inflation. But this is a desperate attempt to keep the financial system alive while squeezing the population. That is, no longer are they able to get enough loot from the developing sector, partly because it's not there in some cases, and partly because of the resistance to it. So now the squeeze is on the population, the working population, and the middle class of the advanced sector. And we're seeing the loss of income security due to inflation, unemployment, and so on. And the European Union and the European Central Bank are following the footsteps of the Federal Reserve. We see strikes in the United Kingdom. We see more than 2 million people marching in the last couple of days in France against the pension reform, which is really an attempt to grab more funds from retirees and future retirees. We see poverty growing in Greece. No amount of looting, let me repeat this, no amount of looting of the Global South could cover the ballooning debt in the world. Now, as LaRouche forecast, the looting is spreading to the developed sector, and it's being done against people in the so-called advanced sector. Now, if Biden wants to shoot down balloons, which apparently he does, how about the debt balloon? The way to do that is debt moratorium, debt restructuring, bankruptcy reorganization, and then moving to a new financial system which makes credit available not for speculation, not for bailouts of bankrupt corporate cartels, but for investment in the real physical economy. Now, finally, I'm sure many of you joined me yesterday in chuckling at the latest example of idiocy related to NATO's war against Russia. You know, the story of a private yacht that was commanded by a small team of divers that supposedly planted the bombs that blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, it really isn't funny because the danger of World War III remains as a result precisely of this kind of spin and this kind of lying and censorship. The cover-up of Seymour Hersh's much more realistic assessment of what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, maybe someone with Biden's mental state believes this latest cover-up will be acceptable to the population that's suffering now from soaring energy costs as a result of the explosion on the pipelines. But I don't think it's going to hold up. And the more there's an attempt to create these kinds of disinformation, the more they discredit their own media and their own government spokesmen. Now, again, yesterday, with the discussion I had with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, we talked about the long-term plans that were put in place to dismantle Russia and the escalation of these leading up to the special military operation in Ukraine and now taking off more aggressively, with think tanks having discussions of how to break apart Russia into a series of smaller states. This is part of the purpose of the Ukraine war, and it's part of the insane drive toward World War III. So you can look at that, listen to what Mrs. LaRouche has to say, and spread this around. Get people to know that this has nothing to do with the protection of the Ukrainian people. If it did, why pull off a coup that put Ukraine more directly under the control of the International Monetary Fund, and Zelensky passing legislation handing fertile Ukrainian soil to the swindlers and speculators of BlackRock, Vanguard, and others? Now, finally, let me call your attention to a coming conference, a Schiller Institute Youth Conference this Saturday. I'll have a registration form linked on the bottom of the description page. Here's a chance for young people, and also some of you my age and a little younger, to participate in a discussion with a growing group of young cadre committed to the idea of a new security and development architecture. So take advantage of that. I'll see you again tomorrow. Tomorrow's Friday. I'll take your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com.